The middle of nowhere. The term in itself already holds many questions. What classifies something as the middle of nowhere? Is it the lack of people in said place? Or is it just that? Nowhere. In today's video, I will be telling two stories. The first one being a cryptid encounter. The second, a story of a haunted home, surrounded by nothing but dense forest. A huge thank you to the writers. If you'd like to send in a story of your own, you can send it to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, a like and a comment is always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Aunt Janet and Uncle Robert never had children, which is probably why they were so excited for me to spend the summer with them in Wexford County in Michigan. They moved to Detroit a long time ago, and then, about a year ago, my aunt died. I don't live anywhere near Michigan, so I could not even attend the funeral. I can still remember how I used to love spending the summer with her and her husband. Not every summer, of course. But I think I must have been there about 7 times when I was a kid. I remember the meadow surrounding my aunt's house, and the woods nearby. I would always have a great time when I was at Aunt Janet's place. That one summer, however, I had just turned 12 years old, did not leave me with only happy memories. My aunt and uncle welcomed me into their home and, since I was tired, let me go to bed early. When I woke in the morning, I made my way into the kitchen where Janet and Robert were preparing breakfast. After eating, they told me to follow them outside. I saw the excited looks on their faces, as they said they had a surprise for me. Behind the house, there was a large tree growing in the middle of one of the meadows. It was closer to the woods than to the actual house, but it was still on my aunt and uncle's property. The two of them took me by the hands and led me toward the tree. Here we are. Now, it's a little late for a birthday gift, and I'm not sure if you're a bit too old for something like this, but I think you'll like it. We worked really hard on it. Janet said and pointed up to the treetop. There, partially hidden amongst the branches, sat a small, beautiful treehouse. "What do you think, kid?" Robert asked. "I love it," I squealed. "Thank you so much. Can I go inside?" "Go right ahead, sweetheart," Aunt Janet said softly. "There's a rope ladder at the side of the tree." I ran towards the tree and climbed up the ladder. As I finally reached the top, I pulled myself up and set foot into my treehouse for the first time. It was amazing. It was not very big, but I loved it from the very first moment. There was a gray rug on the floor, and it even had 3 windows, so one could look outside to either side of the treehouse. Looking out of the window across the entrance, one could see the woods. To the left and right, I had a nice view over the grass fields, and as I turned around to look out of the entrance, I could see my aunt and uncle on the ground waving at me. I spent almost the whole day in the treehouse. At first, Aunt Janet and Uncle Robert kept me company. We played board games and just fooled around in the tree. Uncle Robert kept pretending to stumble and fall through the entrance to make us laugh, and my aunt told us jokes. After a few hours, Janet had to go back to the house to cook lunch, leaving me alone with Robert. Still laughing, I leaned out of the treehouse and gazed over at Janet. Then I turned around to face my uncle again, the grin quickly fading from my face, when I noticed how his expression had changed. Just a moment ago, he had had a wide grin on his face, but now he looked stern, and somehow even a bit worried. "Robert?" I asked carefully. "Is something the matter?" He just sat and looked at me for a while without answering. It felt like an eternity. Finally, he opened his mouth and said, "Look, kid, your aunt doesn't like me talking about this stuff. She says it freaks her out, and that it's just stupid and weird. I don't." He stopped for a second, took off his cap and wiped his brow. "I do not want to scare you. This is not some made-up campfire story. I just want you to be safe. You're getting older. Older kids want to stay up longer. They don't get tired that soon anymore, and then they'll want to stay outside longer. After dark, and that's why I'm telling you this." He paused again and looked at me. I stared back at him with wide eyes, waiting for him to reveal whatever it was that his wife did not want him to talk about. "There's something in the woods. I don't know if it's just one. Could be a whole bunch. Either way, I saw it, and so have others. That way I know I didn't just dream it or something. Your aunt has never seen one, so I don't blame her for not believing me. But I hope you do. The thing I saw was messed up. It was not like any animal you'll ever read about in a book. In fact, I think it wasn't an animal at all. That's why your aunt thinks I'm crazy. He paused once again. I bet you think I'm crazy now too. A little. I answered honestly. My uncle laughed. Well, I guess it really does sound a bit weird. If I told you that there was a monster in the woods that only comes out at night, you wouldn't believe it, I assume. What if I told you there was a bunch of dangerous wild animals? Would you believe me then? I mean, I guess. Well, then there's a bunch of wild animals in the woods, kid. Don't go in there after dark. I won't? I promised, confused and unsure of what to say. My uncle grinned at me. We continued to play more board games until my aunt called us inside to eat. It was as if the conversation my uncle and I had just had never took place. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had told me. After lunch, I went back to the treehouse, but it was not quite as fun all on my own, so I asked my aunt and uncle to go on a walk with me. They said sure, and we went into the woods. After having walked for a while, my uncle had a glorious idea to play hide and seek. I was the first one to seek, and it was my uncle that I found first. He wasn't very good at it. He had been hiding under a tree, and when I found him, he stood up so quickly that he hit his head on a thick branch. In the end, my aunt had to go back to the house with him since he was bleeding a little. I said that I wanted to stay in the woods just a little longer, and after thinking it over, my aunt said it was okay, but that I should come back home before sunset. I told her I would, thoughts of Robert's warning still in the back of my head. I gazed after them as they walked away. Then I began to look for a tree to climb. Climbing trees was kind of my thing back then. I was actually pretty good at it, and I loved challenges, so I chose a really large tree. I was tall for my age, so I could easily reach the first few branches. I carefully pulled myself up, then reached for the next branch, then the next. It was difficult, and I started to get a little exhausted, so I decided to take a short break. I held onto the branch above me and dared to look down. I let out a gasp when I noticed how high up I was. That's when I heard it, a loud crack coming from right above me. Suddenly there was nothing there to hold on to anymore, and before I knew it, I was falling. I shrieked. I felt a throbbing pain erupting in my left leg as soon as I hit the ground. I tried to stand up, but I couldn't. Tears began welling up in my eyes. I knew there was no use in trying to scream for my aunt and uncle. So I had two possibilities. I could either wait until they would come back to look for me, or I could try to somehow hobble back to the house. I decided on the second option. I got on all fours and began to crawl, trying to put as little weight as possible onto my left leg. But no matter how slow I went, the pain in my leg only worsened. So I had to sit down after about 10 minutes. It took me a moment to catch my breath until I felt like I could carry on. I managed to get a little farther this time. I sat down under a tree, again breathless, and began examining my aching leg. I did not think it was broken, but I assumed I had a sprained ankle. I let out a long sigh and leaned back against the tree. I wanted to rest. Just for a minute or two. I had to. I closed my eyes. The cry of a bird startled me awake. I shot up, in shock. I realized that my surroundings were illuminated by the surreal-looking light of sunset. I should not have allowed myself to fall asleep. The sun was setting. I was supposed to be home by now. I began dragging myself through the underbrush. Soon I began to pant, and the sweat running down my cheeks and forehead did little to cool me off. And yet, I had to get home somehow. The edge of the woods was still nowhere in sight. Maybe my aunt and uncle would come look for me, I told myself. Still, I should at least try to get a little closer. This way it would be easier for them to find me. I assumed Janet had patched up Uncle Robert by now. The thought of him reminded me of what he had told me, what he had warned me of. The light of the setting sun was now rapidly fading away. It was getting darker and darker, and I was still not out of the woods. I began to get nervous. I kept on crawling, trying to gain speed, but no matter how hard you try to hurry, you're never very fast when you're down on all fours, and can't even use both of your legs properly. The sweat on my face began to mix with the tears dripping from my eyes. I never was very brave or tough. To be honest, I stayed a crybaby for a long time after that. I was just about to sit down and start bawling my eyes out when I heard it. Barking. A dog was barking somewhere, and as far as I could tell, it was not all that far away. I stayed still and focused. For a short while everything was silent. Then I heard it again. It was closer this time. Just a tiny bit, but still noticeable. I began to panic. Something about this was wrong. The barking came from deeper within the woods. If someone were to just walk their dog, I could not hear them. Just their dog. It made little sense to me. Plus it sounded strange. There was something off about it. It reminded me of someone imitating a bark. Like how even if they are really good at it, the result would still sound a little different from a real dog barking. And that's what it sounded like. A convincing bark, with just a remainder of human's voice resonating within it. It's strange how something as small as this, something that seems like a negligible detail on first glance, can trigger an impulse that is so sudden and yet so strong that one just cannot help but obey it. So, overrun by the sudden fear creeping up inside me, I stood up. My left leg immediately began aching about 3 times as bad as before, but I ignored it. Instead, I began limping into the direction of the wood's edge. The many days I had spent running around this forest with my aunt and uncle paid off. I was injured, scared and weak, but I knew which way to go. By now there was just enough light left to illuminate the ground in front of me. I hobbled through the woods, slow yet way faster than I had moved on all fours. The pain in my leg was worsening. I gritted my teeth and hobbled on. I did not stand still. Not even when I noticed the slight rustling in the underbrush, seemingly following me. Finally, I could see the forest edge in front of me. I let out a gasp as I started going just a little faster, hurrying towards it. That's when I heard it. A long, deep growl coming from somewhere behind me. I pressed my hand in front of my mouth before I could let out a scream. What followed was the sound of something leaping out of the bushes nearby. I didn't dare to turn around. I needed to act quickly. It seemed to still be at a safe distance. If I was just fast enough, I figured I could make it to the safety of the house. My mind was racing. My instincts took over. While these thoughts were still shooting through my head, I burst into a sprint. I ran. I actually ran. Every step I took, ungainly pacing my injured foot in front of me, hurt in a way that would have probably made me pass out in any other situation. But the sound of the unnatural growling and barking, the noise of large paws drumming on the ground as whatever was chasing me picked up its speed kept me going. How I did not trip and fall is beyond my understanding. I stumbled on, crossing the grass fields, wheezing and blinking as I tried to keep tears of pain and fear from blinding me. My pursuer got closer. I could hear the growling and panting growing louder and louder. That's when I knew I would not make it. Not to the house at least. But there, almost right in front of me, was the tree that carried the treehouse. I ran towards it and hastily began to pull myself up the ladder, my sweaty fingers cramping around the rope as to avoid slipping. Had I failed to do so, I surely would have fallen to my death at the paws of this thing. But somehow I made it up and drew in the rope ladder after me. Panting, I crawled over to the window, overlooking the edge of the woods and the part of the meadow I had just crossed. Thankfully, with the moonlight not being blocked out by any trees anymore, I could see just about everything I needed. And there it was. Right underneath the tree stood a giant of a dog. Its filthy fur was still standing on end, in an open display of aggression. It looked around, its large head swinging and its teeth clenched, saliva dripping from its maw. It was looking for me. Confused, it began to circle the tree, not noticing that I was following it from window to window. Finally, it came to a halt underneath the entrance of the treehouse, where it raised its head and looked up at me. I let out a gasp as our eyes met. I could not see everything due to the relative darkness, but the chill running down my spine was enough to confirm that these eyes were not that of a dog. Their gaze felt draining and empty, and I could clearly feel the wrath radiating from them. This was not a wild animal. This was not a dog. This was something else, and it was the very thing that my uncle had warned me about. I stared down at the beast perched underneath the tree, and it stared back up at me. I don't know what I was thinking when I decided to yell at it. I guess I thought it might make it go away. "Get away from me! Get lost!" I shouted. For a moment all was silent. Then the thing let out an unearthly scream, rose to its hind paws and stood upright. I just stared. It must have stood around 7 feet tall. We must have stayed like this for a minute or two, or at least it felt like it. Then finally it let out a long howl, turned and ran away on its hind legs. I rushed to the window across from where I had just stood, and watched it disappear back into the woods to where it had come from. I stood there for a while, unable to comprehend what had just happened. When I was sure it would not come back, I threw out the rope ladder and climbed back down. Just when my feet hit the ground, a sharp pain in my left leg reminded me of what was probably a sprained ankle. I limped over to my aunt and uncle's house. Upon approaching, I found that there was a note on the door. I gently detached the piece of paper from the needle, with which it had been stuck to the wood. "Dear Clover, your uncle and I are at the hospital. He felt really dizzy, so I decided it would be best to have a doctor look at him. Please use the spare key to let yourself in. I can't tell you when we'll be back. But I trust you can stay here on your own for a few hours. You're a big girl after all. Love, Janet." I bent down to grab the hidden spare key from under the doormats, unlocked the door and got inside. I barricaded myself, making sure all the doors and windows were shut and locked. Then I sank down on the couch and freed my now swollen ankle from my shoe and sock. When my aunt and uncle came home an hour later, my aunt almost got a heart attack. "Honey, what happened?" she shrieked. "I fell off a tree." I said calmly, "Oh no, we should have never left you alone. I'm so sorry." She cried. "I'll get you to the hospital immediately." Uncle Robert, who had a bandage neatly wrapped around his head and looked a bit better than before, picked me up and carried me to their car, where he climbed with me into the back seat. He joked about how the hospital staff was going to be really surprised when they'd see the same people come in again, to which Janet told him to shut up. I glanced down at my ankle, and then at my torn jeans. Robert went quiet and looked at me, then bent down and said in a low voice. There was something else going on though, wasn't there? For a moment I did not quite know what to tell him, but then I just murmured. There were some wild animals in the woods. I had to really hurry to get home. He just nodded and gave me a sympathetic look, a look that told me he knew what I meant. Apart from my aunt's constant apologies, there was not a word spoken on the whole car ride. Fortunately, when we arrived at the hospital, a doctor was able to check up on my leg right away. Just as I had thought, my ankle was sprained. I had also twisted my leg in the process of falling, and had a contusion on my left knee. I remember being unable to sleep that night. Not only was my foot still in pain, but I could not stop thinking about what I had seen. I knew I did not just imagine it, but I could not believe it either. Just the thought of that moment when it stood up on two paws made me shiver. It made me wonder why my uncle did not insist on moving away when he had first encountered this thing. I never saw that dog again. I called a dog reluctantly, seeing as I know for sure that this was something entirely different. I spent just 2 more summers with my aunt and uncle. It just wasn't quite as pleasant anymore. Every night I spent at their place would be a sleepless one. The memory of the chase, the thoughts of that creature and the sound of paw steps circling the house when everybody else was already asleep kept me awake. I must have suppressed these memories, or maybe it's just one of these things that one forgets when they get older. And yet, I am typing this because it all came flooding back to me today. Today of all days. So many years later, I happened to turn on the radio on just the right channel, and in just the right moment, to hear the moderator announce an old song that I had never once heard before. Indeed, I had never heard the legend before, but when the voice narrating the poem began to tell the tale of the dogman roaming the Michigan woods, I was immediately brought back into the treehouse, staring down at the creature as it stood on two paws. Now, the only thing I can think of is that somewhere around Wexford County, there are dogs walking upright, and that on some large tree, there are the remains of the treehouse that saved me that night. I wonder how Uncle Robert is doing. When I was 16, my parents decided that we had to move. For some reasons undisclosed to us kids, we packed our stuff and, within a week, we were moving upstate. I figured it was financial problems. But my parents don't like to discuss their money issues around us. The drive was about 2 hours from our old home in Portland, Maine. The house itself was located in the middle of nowhere, situated in the center of dense forest. My dad said there was a lake nearby, and that the house was historic, and overall, it would be a fun place to explore. I am the oldest sibling, and I have 3 younger brothers and 2 sisters, the youngest being 7 at the time. For them, I'd assumed this would be a fun adventure. But for me, well, I just wanted to talk to friends and go out on weekends to the movies and stuff. This whole moving thing was a nightmare for me. Moving in was exhausting. The house was rickety, with tons of random, aesthetic-y staircases, and small doors would get jammed easily, making it impossible to shoulder through with a big box in hand. On top of that, the moving van got lost twice. It wasn't like there was another property for a mile or so around, but alas, it took them 2 extra hours just to arrive. As the week ended and we were mainly unpacked, save for the basement and the attic, I decided to poke my head around for real this time. I had put things all over per my parents' instructions, but I hadn't really gotten a good look at any room in the house. The first floor had the basics: a bathroom, kitchen, living room, and dining room. The second floor had my parents' bedroom and my twin brothers' rooms, and a bathroom. The third floor was where the rest of us were, as well as the attic. The so-called attic was actually just an unfinished crawl space-like room that stored all of our extra clothes and sports things we couldn't shove into the basement. Speaking of, the basement was giant and freezing, with a concrete floor. Even with 6 kids' stuff, holiday things, a washer and dryer and freezer, and whatever else, there was still a lot of room to spare. Oddly enough though, the basement was the most comforting place in the house. The house is old. That was my dad's explanation to it feeling so weird. Even he, a skeptic of the supernatural, admitted it felt odd. And by odd, he meant that it feels as if you're being watched. It is hard to put into words, but it feels like there is an old man hunched in the corner of every room, watching with weary, angry eyes. I described it to my friends as, you know that old guy in the horror movies, where he's like standing in the window, glaring at the kids across the street, making sure they don't step on his lawn or something like that? Yeah, it feels like that. Like being watched, stared at, or stalked, sometimes even at night. It is the most prominent on the 3rd floor, and as one descends lower into the house, it lessens. But even in the basement, it is still there. Whatever the feeling is, it is still there, inescapable. My mom encouraged us to try and ignore it, as it may be us just settling into this brand new, but very old home. Our old house in Portland wasn't fresh out of the oven per se, but it was at least built close to this century. According to our dad, this house was built in the early 1800s. Maybe even older, but without proper records. It was bound to be haunted. Nearly a month went by, and summer was coming to an end. School was starting again, and all of us kids were nervous out of our minds because we had, 1, always lived within walking distance to our school, and 2, we're going to a completely new place, with completely new people. Our mom said she would walk us to the bus stop on the first day, and show us where it was, but after that, we all walked together but without her, as she had work to go to. Well, at the bus stop, our mom asked us, "Do you guys still feel weird in the house?" One of my sisters, who is 14, said, "It feels like I'm being watched. It's creepy, Mom." Now, I never really told anyone aside from my friends back in Portland about how I felt. I never told my sister about how I felt, like it was an old man watching us day in and day out. As soon as the words left her mouth, I got a crazy chill down my spine. Needless to say, I could barely concentrate the first day of classes, and I really didn't want to go home. Months passed and nothing changed. Nothing got worse, but it didn't get better either. We all talked about it, about how we felt as if we were being stared at all the time. But aside from the occasional remarks, we didn't really talk about it. It was a paranoia-inducing feeling, and it was exhausting constantly being on edge all the time. By the time Christmas rolled around, I was tired, anxious, and wanted to move again. Of course, that wasn't going to happen. Luckily, Christmas passed without a hitch. Extended family came to visit, and with so much cheer going around, it was hard to focus on the negativity of being stalked by nothing. But then the grandparents and the cousins left and everything felt empty again. It was the middle of February when I got sick with a really bad flu. I had a strong immune system and never got sick, so taking a week from school was no issue, because I had never missed a day yet. It was Thursday, almost 10 in the morning, and I was sleeping. My parents weren't home, and I was finally on the mend, and my mom had missed 2 days already, taking care of me. I jolted awake to a crash. Even in my disheveled state, I knew it was from the attic a few doors down from my room. I remained laying down, tentative but not really scared, as I thought something just toppled over. We had spent nearly a month with extended family coming over, and boxes were shoved around that whole time to pull out decorations and old games, and hand-me-downs. So I assumed something fell, but as I was falling back asleep, I heard the doorknob to the attic twisting. It squeaked before the latch popped back into place, and the door creaked open. I went stiff, my heart in my throat, and hammering in my ears. I couldn't move. Fight or flight? Yeah, more like fight, flight, or freeze. My first thought was that someone broke in. I had seen a video on YouTube about the guy who discovered a lady living in his crawl space for months, eating his food and peeing in his sink. And it flashed in my mind as the door stopped moving. I waited for footsteps, but nothing came. The silence dragged on, and I wanted so badly to drag myself out of bed, run down the stairs and out of the house. But the attic was right next to the stairs. I heard another thump, like something falling over again. I grabbed the closest weapon I could find, my floor lamp, and began to inch towards my closed door. A flurry of footsteps rushed down the hall towards me. They were fast, insanely fast, faster than any human I'd ever heard, and I whipped my door open, ready to stab at the intruder just as the steps stopped at my door. And nothing. There was nothing. Nobody, not a single person. I was met with the empty hallway and the attic door swung wide open at the other end of the hall. Those footsteps weren't human. As I slammed the attic door closed, blocked it off with the side table in the hallway, and ran downstairs to sleep on the sofa, I realized just how inhuman those footsteps were. They were heavy, like an adult's, but there were so many. As if a 200-pound baby was running at my door. If it had been an intruder, it would take maybe 5 or 6 strides to go from the attic to my door. But this had dozens of footfalls. I passed out on the sofa within a few minutes of my head touching the pillow. I told my parents for almost a week, and my mom encouraged me to sleep downstairs, on the sofa, if I was scared. She didn't want me to not be sleeping, and she didn't want me to be afraid. She even asked if she wanted me to set up an air mattress in their room, so that I could stay with them. But I was the oldest, and a boy, and I shouldn't be so scared when my younger sister's room was right next to the attic and she was fine. That's when I had the genius idea of asking her how she was doing. We were at the dinner table, and I was helping her with homework, when I asked, "So, do you like this house?" She shrugged, and I pushed on. "Well, how are you sleeping? Nothing is keeping you awake, right?" My sister shook her head, and for a minute, I thought I was just imagining everything. Maybe my fever spiked without me knowing, and I was hallucinating. But then she perked up and said, Kansas keeps me awake. Kansas? Like the state? I laughed. She pouted. No, like the person. Then I got cold. Really cold. The feeling of being watched got worse suddenly, and we both felt it, because she suddenly got all wiggly and was spinning around to look behind us at the staircase leading up. I, too, couldn't break my gaze from there. It felt like that old man was staring at us through the bars of the staircase, crouched low and eyes bulging. Of course, there was nobody there. I turned back to my sister and, as calmly as possible, asked, "What is Kansas like?" She shrugged again. I wanted her to keep talking, but my mom and twin brothers walked through the door, carrying groceries, interrupting my thoughts and dispersing the overwhelming feeling of being watched. And before I knew it, we had lived in the house nearly a whole year. The last week of classes ended, and summer break finally began. I was in my room, not doing anything in particular. My brother was in his room, the one next to mine, blasting music and cleaning, the sounds vibrating the thin walls. That's when I heard a loud thump. My brother's music stopped seconds after. At first I thought he dropped something, and he called for me. I reluctantly got out of bed, and when I got to the hall, he was poking his head out the door. I followed his gaze down the hallway, where the attic door was opened wide. We both looked at each other, and hesitantly inched towards it. I moved to slam it closed, but he decided to shine his flashlight inside, the genius. As the light slipped over the boxes, the shadows climbed up the unfinished walls before dropping back down. My skin crawled as I watched, hovering next to him. That's when we both saw it. Something moved. It, whatever it was black and solid like a shadow, and it ducked behind a box as the light crept towards it. We both screamed. He jumped back as I slammed the door shut and shoved my body against it. Our dad called for us from downstairs, and I shouted, "Go get Dad," to my brother. He disappeared down the steps and I was left alone, panting, splayed against the door like an idiot, as if a demonic ghost shadow thing couldn't just phase through the door and kill me. My dad checked through the entire room, moving boxes, opening the ones big enough for someone to hypothetically empty and crouch inside. He was meticulous about it, and when he was satisfied, he stepped out of the room, closed the door, and told me and my brother, "Nobody's in there, boys." Nobody, yeah. But what about something? My brother asked. My dad frowned as if trying to understand. I clarified, "Is this place haunted or what?" Then my dad's face went white, blood draining from his features. He moved around us and waved for us to follow him down the stairs. When I asked why, he said, "Because I want you downstairs." That night my mom gathered us all around, and my dad sat next to her on the couch. My little sister was asleep in their room, and my twin brothers were asleep too. That left me, my 15-year-old sister, and my 13-year-old brother. My dad broke the ice to us pretty nicely, saying that the house was old, and it wasn't unlikely one of the previous owners could have died in it. My mom added that she thought the place was a little special before moving in, when looking at it on the market, but she didn't want that to deter us from a good purchase, as she wasn't really sure ghosts were even real. But then my dad told us about how, when on the third floor working on repairing the bathroom one day over winter break, it sounded like a TV was on in the attic. I heard voices, but when I opened the door, the voices stopped. And then my mom chimed in, saying that when she was taking care of me when I had the flu really bad the first day I was sick, I was walking past the attic and I heard a strange sound, so I was curious, and I went to go investigate when I saw the door handle jiggle. And I thought it was my imagination, because, as you know, I was working long hours in the lab, so I was really tired. But then I opened the door and there was nothing. Talking it through with my parents was the hardest part. I always thought that my parents were immortal, and that they could defeat the ghosts, make the idea completely disappear if they wanted to. But I realized that night that they were just as much of a victim of whatever was in this house as we kids were. But then my mom said, "I don't think this is a bad spirit. I just think it needs to adjust to us living here. The lady that lived here before us was living alone for almost 30 years, So of course 6 kids and 2 new adults would be spooky for it. Give it time. I graduated next year. Little things happened here and there, and one final terrifying thing happened before I left for college. My little sister, dubbing the thing in the attic Kansas, said that she saw someone in her room one night. She said it was Kansas, but he was watching her sleep from the foot of the bed. My mom crammed the twins into one room and moved my little sister into the free room downstairs. She assured me, my sister, and my brother that if something happens, she can make arrangements to move us too, but nothing else really did happen. I am now 22 years old, and I have been back to the house over summer and winter breaks, staying in my old room. Nothing happens every time I visit. And with my brother and sister moving out for college as well, the entire upstairs is basically abandoned. Though I do have to say, it's unsettling to come home and, as soon as I step over the threshold, I feel those eyes on me again. The feeling of being watched hasn't gone away over the years, but now that I live in an apartment and away from home most of the time, I have to say, I kind of miss the thrill of it all.